Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Despite the talk, isn't it the case that the only actions the Abbott-Turnbull government have taken on income tax has been to freeze the tax-free threshold and increase the top tax rate? Doesn't this mean that the only actions on income tax taken by this Liberal government since the last election have been to increase the amount of income tax paid by Australians?
Member for Corangamite. The member for Corangamite will cease interjecting. The Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, I thank the member for his question because it gives me the opportunity to run through what this government has been doing when it comes to tax, Mr Speaker. Combating multinational tax avoidance, Mr Speaker. It was this government that brought that legislation into this House, and it was that opposition who voted against it, Mr Speaker. They are the ones who voted against cracking down on multinational tax avoidance, Mr Speaker, and they are the ones who have gone out there all hairy-chested and hairy-chinned, Mr Speaker, and saying how they oppose our position on strengthening competition laws, Mr Speaker, and I wonder who they're doing that in favour of, Mr Speaker. In addition to that, there were measures in last year's budget, of course, to increase the instant asset write-off for small business, Speaker. That was an important change, Mr Speaker. That's what we've done for small business. In addition to that, Mr Speaker, we have acted, Mr Speaker, in this parliament to put in place tax incentives for angel investors, Mr Speaker, of $106 million. That was brought into this House just this week. In addition to that, as part of other measures, farm management deposits, Mr Speaker, farm management deposits to double the deposit limit to $800,000 a year, Mr Speaker. These are the sorts of changes that we've been putting in place, Mr Speaker. And of course, in addition to these measures, we have reversed the carbon tax of those opposite, Mr Speaker. We've reversed the mining tax, Mr Speaker.
The member for Parramatta will cease interjecting. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, on direct relevance, the question referred to one form of taxation only, income tax, and challenged the Treasurer that it has gone up under this government. On direct relevance, under the rulings you've previously given, he can say a number of things about income tax, but that does not give him licence to go to every other form of tax other than the one he was asked about.
The Treasurer resume his seat. Members will cease interjecting. I've heard the Manager of Opposition Business, and I'd like to respond to it without a wall of interjections from both sides, I have to say. The Treasurer, I'm listening to very closely, is halfway through the answer. I've made the point that ministers can draw analogies, and I've made the point about the policy topic, but I do say to the Treasurer very clearly that, unlike some other questions that have been asked, and this is not a criticism of the questions, that question did not contain a preamble or any other material. And so I'm listening to the Treasurer closely, and I'd invite him to be relevant to the question.
Mr Speaker, there was income tax relief for Australian Defence Force personnel deployed overseas, Mr Speaker. The member for McMahon says well done. Apparently this is not a matter. This is not a matter the member for McMahon thinks is of any consequence. That we would actually work, Mr Speaker, to give tax relief for Australian Defence Force personnel working overseas, Mr Speaker. Apparently this is not an issue that those opposite think to be of any consequence, Mr Speaker. In addition, employee share schemes, Mr Speaker, have reversing the pernicious measures that were put in place by the member for McMahon, Mr Speaker. And when it comes to personal income tax measures, Mr Speaker, we know the challenges and burdens which are faced by those on this side. We understand the burdens that are faced by people who are paying higher and higher rates of income tax, Mr Speaker. We understand that, and we understand the best way to deal with that, Mr Speaker, is to grow the economy so you can grow revenues to support those changes, Mr Speaker. That's the way you do it, and that's what this government is seeking to do. We will focus our changes on things that will drive investment. As we've considered many tax measures over the course of the last 6 months, there's been a golden rule, Mr Speaker. It's got to drive growth and it's got to drive jobs. These are the benchmarks that we set against the tax measures of this government, Mr Speaker. The measure that those opposite put on tax changes, how much money can they get, Mr Speaker? How much more money can they get to ramp up expenditure as they always do?